Okay, going back to vowels, we're going to talk about two long vowel patterns for A and then for E. All right, so let's focus on A. Okay, long A. There are other ways to make the long A sound besides the A consonant E that we talked about on the very first day. Okay, there are many patterns for a long A. So just basic A, we're going to talk about AI, AY, and EI. So let's start with just A. So let's look at these words I've written up here. All right. I have acorn, basic, fatal, agent, I'm going to say data, not data, apron. And all of you notice there is a long A in all of these. I'm making this little line signify that it's a long A. Right? Okay. So if we break these into syllables, we're actually going to notice something. So we have acorn, basic, fatal, agent, data, and apron. Okay. If you notice, if you look at the end of each syllable, it ends with the letter A. Those are actually what we call open syllables, meaning the syllable ends with a vowel, and it's always mostly going to be a long vowel sound. So acorn, it ends with that vowel, so it's going to be long, A. Bay, it ends with that vowel, so typically it's always long. Basic, fatal, it ends with that vowel. Agent, data, apron. Right? So, and I know some of you might be thinking, hey, wait a second, first day you told us if there's a consonant, vowel, consonant, normally that is short. Well, that's for one syllable words. This is a two syllable word. Okay, once we get into syllables, a lot of the rules change, so be careful of that. So basic. So it ends with just a plain A. So if students try to spell this with a fancy pattern, you can teach them it ends with the long vowel, so it's just going to be an A. So that is the basic A. So let's go to the other two. AI and AY. So there's actually a rule, a way to distinguish how do they know when to use which pattern, because they sound exactly the same, A. All right, well, there is one. Look at these words I'm going to write and see if you notice the pattern and the rule that you can tell your students. All right, so if we look at these words, do you notice anything? Hopefully you notice that AY is always at the end of a word, and that's your rule. So if you have a bunch of words and you have your students read them, if they hear that long A sound at the very end of a word, it is going to be spelled AY. If it's in the middle of a word, it's typically AI. So aid, fail, pain, sting. And these are all, if you notice, one syllable words right here. So betray, yes, is two syllables, but that last syllable ends in that long A sound, both spelled AY. Students often confuse these two, but once you tell them AY is at the end of a word, that can really help them remember which one to use when they spell. So AI and AY. Right. And now we're going to go to EI. Right. So these are more complex and not as many words use EI. So these words typically just become sight words so the students can hear, because you can't, once again, you can't tell the difference sound-wise from EI versus the others, because they all make the same sound, A. So examples of words with EI are a favorite Christmas word, reindeer. All right, students will probably be familiar with that one. All right, vain. Some of these words, like I said, start getting trickier. All right, So we have these words, and like I said, some of these are more complex. Right? But if you notice, they all have the EI. Okay, they're not AI. Right? So you just have to practice these with students. Some of these words, the kids are just going to be familiar with, like reindeer and sleigh. Why? Because of Christmas. But the others, this is definitely a word you will not encounter until the upper grades. But obviously these patterns are something you have to practice, and the more times they see these words, the more they remember. But once again, EI here makes the long A sound. So the two vowels together make a long A sound. So it's not short E, not long E, nor short I, it's long A. Okay, long E. All right, long E. Going to long E, we have EE, EA, and Y. Okay. And also, we're going to get into it. We have EI, and then we have IE. Okay. Long E, there are a lot of patterns besides your E, consonant E. Okay. So let's look at double E. Double E, some good examples are heel, C, kneel. EA, we have heel, if you notice, quite a few homophones here. C, okay. Meal, read. Now they all make EA. All right. So how do students distinguish between these two? Once again, sight word practice. And then obviously you're going to have to start talking about homophones. And then read, you have a read with two E's as well. So just the homophones you have to practice with your students. All right. Now we do need to be careful though, because if you remember, EA from my very first lesson makes the short E sound, and it can also make the long A sound. All right, steak, steak. Okay, so EA has quite a few phonemes, so just be careful with that one. All right, so EI only makes the long E sound when it's after the letter C. Okay, so we have these words, and if you notice, they're obviously more complex. You will not be teaching a kindergartner these words. These are definitely for your upper grade. Right? But if we have our EI, if you notice, they're always followed by a C. Okay, so that is the rule that you can teach your kids. When you hear a C, all right, and you hear that conceit, long E sound immediately after it is spelled EI. All right. So you know that rule I before E except after C, but it doesn't seem to work half the time. Well, when you go by phonemes alone, when you hear that long E sound, it's EI. So going by the sound, ceiling, you hear that long E, it's going to be EI. And IE is another one that you just have to do sight word practice with. Example. All right, so believe, belief, field, and niece. All right, they all have the long E sound there, but it's spelled IE. Okay, so keep that. There, once again, none of these follow a C, so they just have to practice by looking at them. Right? Now, a very last one that I forgot to put up there actually is EY. Okay, so EY is at the end of two-syllable words. There is one exception. All right, valley. You hear that long E sound? It's going to be spelled E-Y, not just Y. So how to know when to use EY? This is the rule. When you hear a two-syllable word and it ends in a long E sound, you spell it EY. So valley, alley, galley. The one exception is the word key. All right, that's one syllable, but it's spelled EY. All right, but you can do the does it look funny test. That looks funny. All right, so, and the does it look funny test is a very valid test. It actually helps quite a bit. So we have that. But you do need to be careful because EY can also make the long A. All right, we have they, that makes the long A sound. So you do need to be careful, all right, when you teach that. There are always exceptions.